0831 entity deploys directed energy discharge. Target, Shizuoka Range, non-populated mountain formation, 43 km northeast of Musutafu. Mountains do not disappear. That is one of those facts you carry through your entire life without ever having to test it, without ever having reason to. Mountains are the definition of permanent. They are older than civilization, older than memory, older than language. They were there before the first human looked up and gave them names, and they will be there. Every intuition in the human nervous system insists on this, after the last human stops looking. At 0831 and 47 seconds, a section of the Shizuoka mountain range ceased to exist. Not collapsed, not pulverized into debris, not displaced. The geological mass, approximately 400 meters of ridgeline, a volume of rock and earth that had been accumulating since the Cretaceous period, was removed from the physical world with a completeness that the seismological monitoring network registered not as an explosion or impact event, but as a sudden absence of mass, like a tooth pulled, like a word deleted. Like something that had been present in every record, every photograph, every map was quietly edited out of the registry of things. The Omega beams had traveled from Darkseid's position above Musutafu to the distant ridgeline in less time than light takes to cross the same distance. The trajectory was visible on satellite imaging as a line of absolute absence, not fire, not energy in any photon-based sense, but a corridor through which possibility itself appeared to have been foreclosed. The mountain was there, and then it was not there. The broadcast. 61 million people watched it happen in real time. Not 61 million people in Japan, 61 million people across the planet, news feeds, social aggregators, the automated live broadcast protocols that had been sharing the Musutafu incident globally since the first minutes of the event. The manifestation had drawn international attention. The engagement footage, Endeavor's fire becoming nothing, All Might's punch achieving nothing, had been shared across every platform and had generated the kind of virality that precedes cultural watershed moments. So when the Omega beams fired, the audience was already there. The collective psychological experience of 61 million people watching a mountain vanish simultaneously is difficult to characterize with precision. The data available: social media sentiment collapse, emergency psychological service call volume in 12 countries, a 7% drop in global stock markets within 4 minutes of the event speaks to the scale. The quality is harder. Dr. Yamamura Keiko, clinical psychologist, HPSC crisis response team. The mountain was a symbol in the same way All Might is a symbol, not because anyone thought about it consciously, but because permanence is a psychological anchor. When something that was supposed to be permanent stops existing, it doesn't just frighten people about the specific thing. It destabilizes their entire framework of what permanent means. If that can go, what cannot go? The shift that the HPSC's monitoring infrastructure recorded at 0832 is the shift that this section's designation, psychological breakpoint, refers to. Prior to the mountain's erasure, the fear being experienced was large and real and unprecedented, but it was still geographically located. It was happening in Musutafu. It was happening to people who lived there or near there, or who had reason to feel personal proximity to the event. The rest of the world was watching, processing, feeling second-hand dread. After the mountain, the fear became planetary. Because a mountain in Shizuoka has nothing to do with Musutafu. It is in a different prefecture, a different landscape, a different context. Its erasure communicated a single piece of information with perfect clarity. This entity is not operating on a local scale. Its reach is not city-sized. It is demonstrating capability against a target it has no particular reason to choose, simply to demonstrate that the choosing is entirely its own, and that the target's size or distance or apparent invulnerability to ordinary forces is irrelevant. It was not firing at the mountain because the mountain was a target. It was firing at the mountain to tell the planet that everything is a target. The behavioral response data from the 48 hours following the mountain's erasure contains an anomaly that the HPSC's Social Research Division flagged for extended analysis. In 12 urban districts across Japan, crime rates dropped to statistical zero within 90 minutes of the broadcast. Not reduced, zero. Active criminal operations ceased. Ongoing theft operations were abandoned mid-execution. 3 individuals in the process of committing violent offenses stopped and turned themselves in to local police stations. The lead researcher on the social analysis rep. Ort described this as the most effective crime suppression event in the history of Hero Society, before adding a sentence that did not appear in the public version of the report. The mechanism was not heroism, it was terror. What had stopped crime was not justice or consequence or the presence of heroes. It was the sudden, globally broadcast demonstration that an entity existed whose capacity for harm made all existing concepts of threat and safety irrelevant. Against that backdrop, the ordinary calculus of criminal risk ceased to function. Why rob a convenience store in a world where a mountain can be erased by something standing 40 kilometers away? This is the first intimation of what the entity will make explicit 17 minutes later, that there is a version of order that does not require goodness, only certainty, and that some portion of any population will find that exchange acceptable. All Might re-engages, second tactical deployment, duration before incapacitation, 4 minutes 12 seconds. All Might went back. This needs to be understood clearly because it's easy to read what follows as failure and miss what precedes it. He had stood in the sky and struck with everything he had and achieved nothing of consequence. He had watched the mountain disappear. He understood, with the full weight of 30 years of experience, exactly what he was returning to and exactly what his chances were. He went back because going back was the right thing to do. This is not bravery as a rhetorical gesture. It is bravery in the most stripped-down technical sense of the word, doing the thing that needs to be done with full knowledge of its cost and without the protection of believing it will work. He did not go back believing he would win. He went back because withdrawing in full public view with 300 cameras pointed at him was not a message he was willing to broadcast. The entity received his second approach without moving. What happened next took 0.4 seconds. The gravitational immobilization field that Darkseid deployed does not have a clean technical parallel in the Quirk analysis framework. The closest classification the post-incident analysis team could produce was a localized gravitational manipulation event that operated on the target's mass at the molecular level, applying compressive and rotational force simultaneously in a way that bypassed all muscular resistance. All Might was suspended midair at approximately 30 meters altitude. The suspension was not violent. There was no impact, no obvious energy discharge, no moment of struggle where he attempted to resist and failed. One moment he was approaching. The next moment he was stopped, held, in place in the sky, unable to move, every muscle in his body exerting force against a constraint that did not have a location he could push against. He was there for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. The cameras never looked away. The Hero Public Safety Commission's media analysis team produced a breakdown of the broadcast footage from those 4 minutes and 12 seconds that is, in some ways, the most painful document in the entire incident record. Not because of what it describes in grand terms, but because of the granular detail. At the 18-second mark, you can see his chest expand with breath. He was controlling his breathing, training reflex. In high-stress situations, you control what you can control. At the 40-second mark, there is visible strain in his neck muscles. He was still trying to move. At 1 minute 50 seconds, the strain is gone, not because he had relaxed, because he had understood, with the part of a professional's mind that processes physical reality before the conscious mind does, that there was no vector available. The trying had stopped not as surrender but as intelligent resource conservation. At 2 minutes 30 seconds, his eyes move. He looks down. He is looking at the city below him, at the people, at what is still there. He holds that position, looking down, not struggling, suspended in the visible embodiment of powerlessness for the remaining 1 minute and 42 seconds until the field releases. Takami Fumikage, UA third-year student, watching from secure bunker feed. I have idolized All Might my entire life. I have his figure on a shelf in my dorm. I know what his face looks like when he's determined. What I saw in those minutes was something I don't have a name for. He was still there. He hadn't stopped being himself. But I could see, I don't know how to explain this, I could see that he was in pain that had nothing to do with the physical constraint. He was watching us watch him. And he knew what we were saying. The public trust index dropped 40% in 90 seconds. That statistic exists in dozens of post-incident analyses, and it appears in each of them without the weight it deserves, because statistics metabolize horror into information and information is easier to ha. NDLE than horror. What 40% in 90 seconds means in human terms is this: a framework of belief that had been built across decades, reinforced by countless victories, woven into the cultural identity of a society, unwound in the time it takes to boil water for tea. It was not, as the section heading names it, merely defeat. Endeavor had been defeated earlier in the incident. Defeat is a thing that happens in the record of individual events. What happened to All Might in those 4 minutes was not an individual event. It was the public, permanent, irrevocable documentation that the symbol of peace was not what the symbol said it was. Not because he had not failed, not in any meaningful sense. He had returned when he didn't have to and been stopped by something that exceeded the scale of his capacity. Failure implies a standard you could have met. This was something else. It was ideological collapse. The belief that goodness at sufficient intensity becomes invulnerable had been filmed, broadcast to 61 million people, and found to be incorrect. That belief was not going to reassemble itself, not completely, not in the way it had existed before. 0838 UA High School Secure Bunker, Level B2. Present Class 2A, Faculty, Support Staff. The bunker was built for villain attacks. It had reinforced walls rated for explosions up to a certain yield, air filtration systems calibrated for quirk-based chemical threats, communication infrastructure hardened against electromagnetic disruption. It was built for the threats that hero society knew how to name. It had not been built to hold 63 students and their faculty while they watched, on a secure broadcast feed, the collapse of everything their training was premised on. Aizawa Shouda, Eraserhead homeroom teacher, the most pragmatic educator in the building, had made the decision to allow the broadcast rather than cut it. He would later explain this decision in a single sentence. If I had turned it off, they would have wondered what I was protecting them from. This was worse, but it was real. Izuku Midoriya had, since approximately 0818, been watching the broadcast with a quality of attention that his classmates recognized as different from theirs. They were watching as people watch disasters, in a state of horror-suspended fascination, unable to look away but also unable to look at it directly, processing in fragments. Midoriya was watching as an analyst watches evidence. His notebook was open. It had been open since the first engagement footage appeared on the feed. By 0838, the pages were dense with observations written in the compressed shorthand that those who had seen his notebooks before recognized as his highest gear cognitive mode, the one that ran faster than his handwriting could follow, that left fragments and abbreviations and arrows connecting observations across multiple pages. The specific analysis he would later reconstruct from those fragments and present to Aizawa identified 3 patterns that no one else in the room, and notably, no one in the HPSC command center, had articulated at that point in the incident. First, no escalation of effort. Across every engagement in the incident, Endeavor, Hawks, Genist, Edshot, All Might twice, the entity had not increased its output. The Hellflame was unmade at the same apparent operational intensity as the mountain's erasure. The gravitational immobilization of All Might had not required any visible preparation or exertion. Every response deployed had been met with the minimum necessary capability, not the maximum available. It was not fighting. It was demonstrating. Second, no emotional fluctuation. The entity had spoken 6 times across the incident. None of the statements had contained what behavioral analysis classified as emotional content: no anger, no satisfaction, no contempt, no urgency. The communications were informational. They were transmissions of position, not expressions of state. Third, no reaction to resistance. This one was the most important and the most unsettling. Every entity in Hero Society's encounter history, every villain, every powerful opponent had some reactive quality to opposition. Resistance, even unsuccessful resistance, produced a response: escalation, adaptation, irritation, calculation. Even the most controlled opponents recalibrated when confronted. Darkseid had not recalibrated once. All Might's second engagement had produced no change in the entity's behavior pattern. The resistance was not registering as a meaningful variable. Midoriya Izuku, written reconstruction of bunker analysis notes. By the time I had those 3 patterns, I understood what we were watching and why the engagement approach was never going to work. You fight villains by finding the thing they want and disrupting it, or finding the thing they fear and threatening it, or finding the edge of their capability and pushing past it. None of those vectors exist here. There is no want to disrupt, no fear to threaten, and we have not located an edge. What we are watching is not a villain trying to win. It is a God proving inevitability. The phrase, a God proving inevitability, moved through the bunker in a way that phrases sometimes do, passing from person to person not as a passed note but as a shared intake of breath. Midoriya had not said it to be dramatic. He had said it because it was the most precise description available, and precision in that space in that moment had its own particular weight. Bakugo Katsuki's response to the footage had been escalating since the incident began in a way that was perfectly consistent with everything Aizawa knew about him and perfectly consistent with being deeply unhelpful in the present context. His aggression had spiked visibly, physically, in the tension of his posture and the frequency with which his hands were clenching, not because the footage frightened him, though it did, but because his primary psychological defense mechanism against fear was the conversion of fear into anger, and anger into the drive to attack something. There was nothing available to attack. This was the particular torment of the situation for Bakugo. He possessed extraordinary power, a genuinely tactical mind, and a will that did not bend easily toward despair, and none of those things were applicable. You cannot explosion blast your way to relevance against an entity that unmade endeavors fire without effort. The power that defined his identity, that he had spent his entire life building and sharpening and betting everything on, was not a meaningful unit in this equation. Todoroki Shoto had gone quiet in a way that Midoriya recognized as strategic paralysis, not the paralysis of fear, but the paralysis of a mind that processes through analysis, encountering a situation in which analysis produces no actionable output. Todoroki was very good at reading situations and identifying the best available response. He had been reading this situation for 20 minutes and had found nothing. The stillness was not calm. It was the exterior surface of a deeply uncomfortable internal state. Uraraka Achako was afraid of helplessness. This was not a new fear. She had encountered it before in the moments in battles where the gap between what she could do and what was needed became visible. But the scale here was different. The gap here was not between Uraraka's capability and a villain's capability. It was between human capability and something for which the word human was not an adequate frame. She sat with that and found it did not have a bottom. Aizawa had been watching his students more than the broadcast. He had been a teacher for long enough to understand that crises were not only what happened in the field, they were what happened in the minds of the people who would eventually have to respond to the field. He was watching his students encounter the limits of the framework they had been trained within, and he was processing, with the particular coldness of a professional who had long ago learned to maintain function in situations that warranted the suspension of it, what this meant for the pedagogy he had been delivering for the past 2 years. Hero training had never included existential threats, not because the people who designed it were naive, but because hero society had never encountered one. The curriculum had been built for the world as it existed, dangerous, complicated, populated with powerful and sometimes incomprehensible villains, but ultimately a world in which the hero's function was coherent and the hero's capacity was adequate to a recognizable category of challenge. What was being broadcast onto the secure feed was a different world, and the people in that room were going to have to decide how to be heroes in it. 0842 Entity broadcasts direct address to civilian population. Method, direct acoustic projection. Received simultaneously across Musutafu metropolitan area and within range of all active broadcast feeds. The offer, when it came, was not dressed up. There was no theater to it, no villain's monologue of grievance and ambition. No declaration of superiority that required your agreement or your submission to feel complete. It was delivered in the same tone in which the entity had delivered all its previous statements, the tone of a fact being stated to someone who does not yet know it. Your world worships strength. I am strength without limitation. Kneel and disorder ends. 11 words, the first 3 framing a diagnosis, the middle 5 identifying the speaker's position within that diagnosis, the final 4 delivering the terms. It is important to spend time on the structure of this offer rather than dismissing it as villainous overreach, because doing so misses the reason it worked on the people it worked on. The offer was not irrational, it was not delusional, it was, as a piece of polit. Eichel philosophy, coherent, arguably more coherent, in its own terms, than several of the ideological frameworks currently operating in the world it was addressing. Crime reports in the affected broadcast districts dropped to statistical 0 within 11 minutes of the offer. 3 mid-tier villain organizations, 2 in the Kanto region, 1 operating in Osaka, issued statements of voluntary surrender to local authorities within the hour. None of the statements cited moral conversion. They cited the calculation that resistance was no longer operationally viable. The remnants of the network once affiliated with Tamura Shigaraki, diminished, scattered, operating in the fragmented way that organizations operate after the loss of their center, went silent. Not withdrawn, not mobilizing. Silent, which, for a network that had always communicated through action, was its own kind of statement. Even among ordinary citizens, the offer found purchase. The HPSC's post-incident survey data is uncomfortable reading in this respect. 14% of respondents indicated that upon hearing the offer, their first emotional response was not resistance or horror but relief. Not agreement, most of them qualified their response extensively in follow-up questioning, but the involuntary, pre-rational sensation of a weight being offered the possibility of being set down. Survey respondent anonymous, female, age 34, Musutafu district resident. I don't want to be ruled by it, I want to be clear about that. But when I heard that disorder could end, something in me exhaled before my brain caught up. I live in a neighborhood where 3 businesses were destroyed by villain activity last year. I have 2 children. The idea that the chaos could just stop, even if the price is. She didn't finish the sentence. Most of the respondents who reported that initial relief response didn't finish the equivalent sentence. The completion of it required confronting a trade that, when made explicit, was clearly unacceptable. But the appeal to that part of the human brain that simply wants the chaos to stop, that wants someone authoritative to stand up and say with complete conviction that it will handle things, was real, and it was not negligible. What Darkseid was offering was not freedom, it was not justice, it was not goodness in any sense that hero society or any functioning moral framework would recognize. What it was offering was certainty. And certainty, in a world that had just watched a mountain disappear and the symbol of peace suspended helpless in the sky, carried a weight that ordinary times would not have given it. Tyranny with certainty feels safer than chaos without control. This is not a comfortable fact. It is, however, a fact that history demonstrates repeatedly across cultures and centuries, and the Black Sky event merely demonstrated it again under conditions of unusual clarity. This was not destruction. It was domination through inevitability, the conversion of demonstrated power into a kind of political offer, the implicit argument that resistance is not a moral position but an exercise in futile suffering, and that the only question is not whether to accept the hierarchy but when. The mountain had been a vocabulary lesson. The suspension of all might had been a demonstration. The offer was the sentence they assembled. 0846 UA student Midoriya Izuku requests emergency evacuation protocol override. Request denied. Student exits secure bunker via secondary emergency access point. He did not have a plan. This point is important, and Midoriya himself made it, clearly and without defensiveness, in both his immediate post-incident statement and in every subsequent conversation about the event. He had no tactical plan. He had no Quirk strategy. He had no realistic assessment of what his physical presence could accomplish against an entity that had rendered the entire assembled force of hero society irrelevant. He was going because going was, in the calculus he had been building his entire life, what you do. Aizawa's voice had followed him through the emergency access point, not ordering him back, just his name once in the tone that contained everything, the recognition of what he was doing, the refusal to pretend it wasn't what it was, and beneath both of those, something that operated at a frequency below words. Midoriya crossed 2 blocks of evacuated street, and stood at the edge of the open plaza below the entity's position. He did not attack. The exchange. The 7 people who had clear sightlines to the plaza from their positions in surrounding buildings would all later independently use variations of the same language to describe what they witnessed. A boy standing very still in an empty street, looking up at something the size of mythology. Midoriya had been thinking, during the 12 minutes since the offer, about the question the entity had put to All Might, the question about WH. It becomes a virtue when power fails. He had been thinking about it the way he thought about everything, which was obsessively and from multiple angles, and in ways that followed the thinking wherever it went rather than stopping at the comfortable conclusions. He had arrived at something. He said it. Power doesn't make you right. 5 words against 11. No prelude, no framing, no argument established before the position. Just the position itself, stated to something that had unmade a mountain. The entity looked down at him for what witnesses estimated as 3 seconds before it replied. Power defines right. 3 words, the purest possible statement of the opposing position, not a counterargument, a replacement, not an engagement with his premise, a dismissal of it in favor of a different premise altogether. This is the core philosophical divide. Hero society had been built on the first position, on the belief, never fully articulated but structurally fundamental, that morality has an existence independent of power. That goodness is not merely the preference of whoever wins, but a real thing, navigable by real people, that directs power rather than being created by it. That the hero is good not because the hero is strong, but because goodness is worth being regardless of whether it wins. Darkseid's position is the other one. In its pure form, right is not a category that exists prior to power. There is no moral order that precedes the order established by whoever is capable of establishing and enforcing order. The universe does not have a preference for virtue. It has a structure, and the structure is determined by what can hold it. Morality is not the foundation. Morality is the story the powerful tell about why their power is legitimate. Midoriya's response to power defines right was not delivered immediately. The witnesses describe a pause of approximately 4 seconds, long enough to be felt. Then you've defined a world where no one is ever actually safe, because there's always something more powerful. You're not offering order. You're offering the illusion of order until something bigger shows up. The entity did not respond. This silence, different from the 22-second silence at the end of Part 1, different in quality if not in duration, was not, the behavioral analysis team would conclude, an absence of response. It was a response. An entity that had spoken with complete economy throughout the incident, that had said exactly what it intended to say and nothing else, had encountered a statement it chose not to answer. That choice is itself data. Midoriya was released from the plaza 17 minutes later when the incident concluded. He walked back to the bunker without running. Aizawa was at the secondary access point. Neither of them said anything for approximately 30 seconds. Then Aizawa said, "Write it down, all of it tonight." 0857 remaining active hero units incapacitated. Entity demonstrates planetary scale potential. No full deployment. Duration of final demonstration, 6 minutes. The last 6 minutes were not a battle. The remaining active hero units, 8 pro heroes who had been held in reserve by the HPSC Command Center as a contingency, their deployment authorization finally released at 0854 when it became clear that the contingency had arrived, engaged with everything they had. The engagement was professional and brave and completely without result. They were not humiliated in the way villains sometimes humiliate opponents to make a point. They were moved aside, filed away. Incapacitated with the minimum force required, without visible strain, without visible interest. The entity had not been fighting at any point in the incident. That understanding, which Midoriya had articulated from his notes, and which the HPSC analysts had been converging toward through their own pathways, crystallized in those 6 minutes into a certainty that required no further argument. What happened at 09:01:33 was what gave the 6 minutes their name in the incident record. The Omega effect, which is the best available term for what the monitoring systems recorded, though its application here was unlike any documented use, radiated from the entity's position not as a targeted discharge, but as an omnidirectional field expansion. It reached an estimated radius of 200 kilometers before stopping. Every instrument within that radius registered the event differently, because the event was not operating on a single physical parameter. Seismic sensors showed no reading. Atmospheric sensors showed no reading. The Quirk analysis systems showed the same insufficient framework message they had been generating since the incident began. What the monitoring systems did register, collectively and concurrently, a modulation of gravitational constants across the entire field radius, not a change sufficient to cause visible physical effects at human scale, a modulation, a demon's demonstration that the variable could be touched. The satellite that recorded it most clearly, the one whose data became the basis for the HPSC's classified technical analysis, captured a readout that its operating team spent 3 weeks verifying before accepting, because the verification required accepting a premise that every prior understanding of physical law said was impossible. The gravitational constant within the field radius had been adjusted and then returned to baseline within 0.7 seconds. Like a dial turned and turned back, like someone showing you a light switch and demonstrating that they control whether the lights work. He was not exerting himself. He was demonstrating hierarchy. He was showing the planet not just the heroes in the plaza, not just the monitoring systems, not just the governments that would receive the analysis reports in the hours following the incident, that the things they had assumed were constants were, within his operational scope, variables. That the architecture of physical reality itself was not the neutral ground on which the confrontation was occurring. That the confrontation was occurring on his ground, whether they acknowledged it or not. It lasted 6 minutes, and then he withdrew. What follows is not a single ending. The incident produced no clean resolution, and any analysis that pretends otherwise is performing tidiness at the expense of truth. What follows are 3 reconstruction scenarios, each internally consistent, each representing a different calculus of what the incident's conclusion actually means. In the darkest realistic reading of the incident's trajectory, the entity's withdrawal was not conclusion but assessment, a pause between reconnaissance and integration, the kind of gap between measuring a system and redesigning it. Earth integrated into an apocalyptic governance structure within 18 months. Hero licenses revoked not through conflict, but through the simple administrative fact that the authority that issued them no longer exists as a sovereign body. Quirks regulated under an authoritarian order whose efficiency, unlike the chaos of villain culture or the aspirational limitations of hero culture, was absolute. In this scenario, hope does not disappear, it transforms. Midoriya does not become a victor. The category of victor has been structurally eliminated from the available options. He becomes a resistance symbol, a different thing, not the inheritor of All Might's capacity, but the keeper of All Might's argument. The 43 pages of notes become a document passed hand to hand in circumstances that would be recognizable to anyone who has ever lived under a system that made truth-telling dangerous. Bakugo goes to the resistance not with joy, but with the grinding determination of someone who has accepted that the fight is no longer about winning, and has found, to his own surprise, that this does not make it less worth fighting. Heroism in this scenario is not the spectacle that hero society built its culture around. It is the quieter, harder, less photographable thing that heroism always was underneath the spectacle. The most analytically defensible reading of the incident's conclusion. The entity leaves after assessing resistance threshold. His 6-minute demonstration was the final data point in an evaluation that had been running since 0814. He came to measure, he measured. What he found, and this is the part that offers the thinnest thread of something worth holding, was a society that had not broken. Damaged, yes. Shaken, yes. Structurally compromised in ways that would take years to understand and longer to address. But not broken, not ready. The statement he issues on departure, "This world is not yet broken enough," is, depending on your framework, either a threat or a diagnosis. The HPSC treats it as a threat. Midoriya, in his written analysis, treats it as the only honest thing the entity said, an acknowledgement that the capacity for resistance, however inadequate against this specific opponent, exists. That hero society had not, in 47 minutes of being shown every reason to collapse, actually collapsed. Hero society survives, but permanently altered. A new doctrine is introduced, slowly and with considerable institutional resistance, under the working title Preparedness-Based Survival, a name that no one likes but that everyone agrees is accurate. The training shifts from optimizing for dominance to optimizing for adaptability. The question being asked of every new hero protocol is not, can this beat the strongest opponent, but can this function when the strongest opponent cannot be beaten? Symbols are replaced by systems. This is not a comfortable transition for a culture built on symbols, and it doesn't complete cleanly within any policy cycle's timeframe, but it begins. A cosmic anomaly disrupts the incident before its natural conclusion. What kind of anomaly is less important than what it may? The entity withdraws not because it chose to, but because something else in the architecture of the multiverse required its attention elsewhere. The heroes survive physically. Every person who was in the field, every student in the bunker, every civilian in the evacuation corridors, they all go home. They do not survive psychologically unaltered, and this is the scenario that may in some ways be hardest to live inside. because physical survival without resolution does not produce the closure that allows processing. It produces a kind of permanent incompleteness, a knowledge that something exists, that it came and demonstrated what it was, and that the thing stopping it from coming back is not anything hero society did but an accident of cosmic circumstance. They are small, they know it now. The question is what smallness means for how you live. Some damage is structural, some damage is chemical, and some damage is to the story a society tells about itself, and that last category is the kind that doesn't show up in the infrastructure repair estimates, but makes itself felt in every subsequent decision, every rebuilt assumption, every moment where the person deciding has to reckon with what they now know. What hero society knows now, and cannot unknow, shapes everything that comes after. Finding one, public faith never fully recovers to pre-incident levels. The psychological stability index settles at a permanently reduced baseline. This is not a crisis, it is a recalibration. A society whose faith in its protectors is premised on those protectors being invincible is a society whose faith is contingent on a lie. A society whose faith persists after the lie has been removed is a more durable thing. The transition is painful, the outcome is not necessarily worse. Finding two, hero rankings lose their primary cultural function. The Billboard chart continues. The rankings are published, but the cultural weight they carry, the sense that the number beside a hero's name is a reliable index of their capacity to handle any conceivable threat, is gone. What the rankings measure, people now understand, is performance within a particular range of challenges. Above that range, the chart is silent. This is honest. It is also disorienting for a culture that used the chart as a proxy for cosmic security. Finding three, international alliances form for planetary defense. The incident forces a conversation that hero society had been avoiding, the question of whether a national hero licensing framework is an adequate structure for threats that are not nationally scoped. The answer, demonstrated empirically by 47 minutes above Musutafu, is no. The diplomatic architecture for international hero coordination begins its slow and politically complicated assembly in the months following the incident. Finding four, Midoriya's ideology matures from strength to resilience. This is perhaps the most significant long-term finding, not because Midoriya's personal development is the center of what matters, but because he is representative of a generation. He entered the incident as a young man who had spent his life studying strength, accumulating strength, believing fundamentally that the right application of sufficient strength was the answer to the category of problems worth solving. He exited it as something more complicated, a person who had stood in an empty street and said true things to something that could erase mountains and had been heard and had not been destroyed, not one, but heard, and had arrived at an understanding that resilience, the capacity to continue being yourself and doing what you believe is right in the absence of any guarantee that it will work, is not a consolation prize for insufficient strength. It is a different and necessary thing. A reconstruction that stays only at the surface of events, the timestamps, the tactical failures, the measurement indices, would be complete in one sense and false in another. The surface is real, but it is not where the meaning lives. This story is not about who wins. There is no winning in this story, not in the sense that hero society's narrative architecture was built to deliver. That absence is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. Hero society was, functionally and by design, a spectacle. Not in a dismissive sense, the spectacle served real functions. It maintained public morale, it communicated the presence and capacity of the protective class, it gave people symbolic anchors for their sense of safety. Spectacle is not inherently false, but it is premised on the ability to perform in a way that confirms the narrative. Inevitability does not perform, it does not need to. When something arrives that is not trying to win the fight but demonstrating that the fight's outcome is not in question, the spectacle machinery has nothing to run. The cameras are still rolling, the heroes are still there, but the thing the cameras exist to capture, the moment of triumph, the turn of the tide, the arrival of the symbol at full power, does not come. What you are left with after the spectacle machinery has run through all its cycles and produced nothing is the question of what exists underneath it. What the heroes are when they are not winning, what the culture is when it cannot be reassured, what goodness is when it cannot demonstrate itself through victory. All Might suspended in the sky, unable to move, looking down at the city, choosing to hold his eyes open and his back straight even in the middle of helplessness, that is one image. Aizawa watching his students process the footage and making the decision to let them see rather than protect them from seeing, that is another. Midoriya crossing evacuated pavement to stand in an empty plaza and say 5 words with no tactical justification, that is a third. Leadership after humiliation is not the restoration of the pre-humiliation status. It is not the performance of confidence that has not been earned. It is the choice to continue being present, visibly, in the aftermath of the thing that demonstrated the limit. It is showing up for the next moment because the next moment needs showing up for, not because the showing up will be rewarded with victory. This is arguably harder than leadership in conditions of success. Success gives you something to point to, defeat that cannot be avenged, limitation that cannot be overcome, a gap in your capacity that cannot be closed with more training or more determination or a better plan. These things demand a form of leadership that hero society had never had to develop because it had never needed it. It needs it now. This is the question the incident leaves open, not as a failure to answer but as a genuine open question, the kind that can only be answered by the choices that come after. Hope in hero society's operational understanding had been attached to victory. Specifically, we have hope because we can win. We trust the heroes because the heroes win. We send our children to UA because the heroes win. Remove the winning, and in that framework, hope has nothing left to adhere to. What the incident offered not as a gift, not with any warmth, but as a brute structural fact, was the possibility of detaching hope from outcome. Of finding something that hope could attach to that was not contingent on the ability to win. Midoriya in the plaza was, in some sense, an early draft of that possibility. He went there without hope of winning. He went there because going was the right thing to do. And he came back and he wrote 43 pages and he kept going. Whether that possibility, hope as a function of choosing what's right rather than expecting to prevail, can scale from one person to a society, is the question hero society is living in the aftermath of the Black Sky event. This reconstruction cannot answer it. The answer is being written in real time, in every decision made by every person who watched the broadcast and woke up the next morning and had to decide what to do next. This is not a story that begins with a villain's laughter or the flash of a cape against a burning skyline. It doesn't open with a rescue, with a rallying cry, with a symbol ascending into the morning light. It begins, instead, with silence, the kind that precedes a thing the world doesn't have language for yet. On a Tuesday morning in Musutafu, when children were walking to school and convenience stores were running their first coffee cycles and pro-heroes were still checking their morning schedules, something arrived, not landed, not appeared, arrived in the way a fact arrives or a death or a truth you've been ignoring. And in the 47 minutes that followed, the infrastructure of hero society, not its buildings, not its roads, but the invisible architecture of belief that held everything upright, began to crack. By the time it was over, 11 pro-heroes had been removed from the field, not defeated in any conventional sense, but rendered irrelevant. The symbol of peace had struck with the full weight of a legend behind him and been answered with a single word. 3.2 million civilians had been displaced from the city center. And the psychological stability index of hero society, a metric the public had never heard of because it had never needed to be invoked, had collapsed by 63% in under an hour. The government classified it tier existential. That classification had never been used before. This document is not a eulogy. It is not a critique. It is a reconstruction, methodical, honest, and unflinching, of exactly what happened, why the systems failed the way they failed, and what it means that they did. This was not a villain attack, it was a systemic stress test, and hero society failed it. To understand how a society breaks, you first have to understand how it held together. Hero society, by the morning of the incident, had reached something close to its own ideal of itself. The crime rate sat at a historic low. Public trust in licensed heroes hovered at 89%, a number that polling agencies described as culturally saturated, meaning it wasn't just confidence in a system, it was identity. People didn't merely trust heroes the way they trusted hospitals or fire departments. They trusted heroes the way they trusted sunrise, consistently, automatically, without interrogating the mechanism. UA High School was operating at full academic capacity. The hero billboard charts had just released their quarterly rankings. The top 10 were stable, recognizable, and widely beloved. Merchandise was selling. Rating numbers for hero-adjacent media programming were at a 6-year high. From the outside and largely from the inside, Hero Society looked like a machine that had finally found its optimal configuration. The three pillars. Any sociologist analyzing the structure would have identified three load-bearing pillars holding the whole thing up. The first was visible strength. The ranking system wasn't merely administrative, it was theatrical. The top 10 existed to be seen. Their presence at incidents, their broadcast battles, their public statements after victories, all of it functioned as ongoing evidence that the strongest people in the world were on your side. You didn't need to know the mechanics of Endeavor's Hellflame or the strategic sophistication behind Hawk's Feather deployment. You just needed to know they were there and that they won. The second pillar was public assurance, the media transparency protocols, the post-battle press conferences, the hero agency social media management teams that existed specifically to translate danger into reassurance. When something bad happened, a hero spoke about it calmly, in full sentences in front of cameras. The format itself was the message: we have this, we always have this. The third pillar was moral certainty. This one was the most invisible and the most critical. It was the implicit promise woven into every hero narrative from childhood onward that goodness ultimately prevails, that the right side wins not merely because it is better funded or better trained, but because it is right. This wasn't naive. Most adults understood it was complicated. But underneath the complication lived a bedrock assumption. At the end of the day, when it genuinely mattered, the hero showed up and the hero won. This assumption had survived Shigaraki. It had survived the Paranormal Liberation War. It had survived All Might's retirement, barely painfully, but it had survived because even in defeat, the narrative could be reframed as transition. The torch passed, the next generation rose, good found a way. What it had not been tested against was something that didn't acknowledge the narrative at all. The morning before. Weather data logged from Yusutafu on the morning of the incident shows clear skies, mild wind, typical autumn conditions for the region. Satellite imaging from the 6 hours prior shows nothing. Anomalous, no energy signatures, no unusual atmospheric readings, no precursor event of any kind that any instrument, human or technological, flagged as worth noting. Endeavor was scheduled for a press appearance at 10. Hawks had a debrief at 9:30. Best Jeanist had a mentorship session with 2 first-year UA students. The Hero Public Safety Commission's morning briefing included 11 items. None of them were this. The world on the morning of the incident was not bracing for anything. That is the first thing you need to understand, not because it makes what happened more shocking, though it does, but because it explains why the response unfolded the way it did. Every protocol, every reflex, every decision tree that got activated was designed for a world that had 37 different words for villain, and no word at all for what walked out of a fold in space above the Musutafu city center at 8:14 in the morning. 081403 Satellite Array Delta 7 registers geometric distortion event. No Quirk signature detected. Classification unknown. The first person to see it wasn't a hero. Yuki Hamasaki, 31 years old, a bicycle courier making her third delivery run of the morning, was crossing the Shintomi Bridge when the air above the commercial district stopped behaving correctly. She would describe it later in a statement to the Hero Public Safety Commission as a moment where the sky folded, not cracked, not split, folded like someone had taken the fabric of the morning and pressed 2 points of it together with a thumb. Hamasaki Yuki, civilian eyewitness. I looked up because the light changed, not like a cloud, like the light itself got confused about where it was supposed to go. And then there was just a place where the air wasn't right, and then he was there, and I couldn't move, not because I was scared, not exactly. It was more like my body understood something my brain hadn't processed yet. Hamasaki's description, and it was not unique. 47 other civilian witnesses used variations of the same spatial language, points towards something the Quirk analysis teams spent considerable time on afterward. There was no energy signature preceding the manifestation because energy, in any conventional sense, was not the mechanism. Something that exists at a level beneath or beyond the physical laws that govern Quirk use simply stepped through a barrier that, until that moment, no one had reason to believe was permeable. Darkseid descended. That word descended is also imprecise, but it's the closest the available language gets. He didn't fall. He didn't fly downward. He moved through altitude the way a fact moves through a conversation, without resistance, without accommodation, as though the air understood it had no jurisdiction over him. Approximately 9 meters in height at this manifestation. Skin the color and texture of stone that has absorbed centuries. Eyes, and this detail appears in almost every eyewitness account, the color of dying stars, a deep, flat red-orange that seemed to generate no warmth whatsoever despite its luminosity. Armor that looked less like it had been crafted and more like it had grown, organic and ancient, and seamlessly integrated with the body beneath it. No weapon visible, no entourage, no statement of arrival, no named organization, no declared purpose. He descended to approximately 40 meters above street level and stopped, and the stopping was, somehow, more disturbing than the arrival. Tanaka Hiroshi, civilian, retired engineer, age 67. I've seen All Might fight, I've seen Endeavor fight. The way powerful people carry themselves, there's always something in it that's still human, even when it's superhuman. Something that's still trying. This was different. This was a thing that had stopped trying anything centuries ago. It just was. At 08:15:47, the Hero Public Safety Commission's emergency response algorithm flagged the event as Priority Alpha, a designation that had been used 17 times in the preceding decade, always for natural disasters or large-scale villain mobilization. The algorithm couldn't classify the energy reading because there wasn't one. It flagged Priority Alpha on the basis of the only data it had: the geometric distortion, the sudden civilian panic readings from the area's biometric crowd monitoring system, and the complete absence of any known reference point. Unknown was itself the emergency. The first statement. At 08:16:22, with the city's emergency broadcast system beginning its activation sequence and news helicopters already banking toward the commercial district, the figure spoke. No amplification, no effort. The voice arrived at the ground level the way his body had arrived through altitude, without apparent mechanism, simply present, simply real. You mistake power for virtue. 7 words. The HPSC communication logs show that the initial automated transcript of the statement was flagged 3 Tim. Eased by the system's contextual analysis layer as non-threat language, meaning the algorithm couldn't classify it as a declaration of hostile intent under any of its established parameters. There was no demand, no stated goal, no identification of a target or a victim class or a desired outcome. Under the system's logic tree, the statement didn't qualify as a threat. This was the first failure, and it was a structural one. Hero Society's response infrastructure had been built to process intent. Villains want something: power, chaos, revenge, recognition, freedom from a system they feel wronged them. You identify the want and you build your response around it. Give them nowhere to run, remove their leverage, appeal to or neutralize the want. 7 words that expressed not a want but an observation short-circuited that entire architecture. It wasn't a threat, it was a diagnosis. And Hero Society's emergency response algorithm had no protocol for being diagnosed. On the ground and in the air, however, the human beings receiving those 7 words had an immediate and visceral reaction that the algorithm couldn't process because it was the right reaction. They were afraid. Not the productive fear that sharpens focus, not the manageable fear that experienced heroes have learned to fold into resolve, something older, something that had no professional training for a context to sit in. The fear of standing in front of a thing that is categorically not concerned with whether you exist. 08:18:00 Pro Hero Response Units Deploy. Initial Tactical Formation. Standard Priority Alpha Villain Engagement Protocol. Give the heroes credit for this, they moved fast. From the first Priority Alpha alert to the deployment of the initial response unit took 4 minutes and 12 seconds, 18 seconds under protocol standard. The system, whatever its classification failures, executed its mobilization function correctly. Endeavor arrived first because Endeavor always arrived first. Hawks was already overhead, having been close enough to the district that the geometric distortion had been visible from his patrol route. Best Genus came in from the west, his fiber control extending ahead of him like a net prepared to close. Edshot materialized at street level, folded to almost nothing, already calculating vectors. From a tactical standpoint, the initial formation was textbook: aerial observation, ground-level penetration threat, long-range restraint capability, overwhelming thermal output to test defensive parameters. It was the formation that had worked against the most powerful villain-class entities Hero Society had faced. It was assembled with genuine competence by genuinely exceptional people. 0818. Endeavor didn't wait for an exchange. He assessed the situation, unknown entity, no declared intent, demonstrated spatial disruption capability, civilian proximity, and made the tactical decision that the situation demanded, immediate maximum output engagement to determine the entity's defensive ceiling. This was, given what he knew, the correct decision. Endeavor's weakness has never been his judgment. What happened next wasn't a failure of his judgment. It was a failure of the universe his judgment was built inside. The hellflame emerged at full saturation. The temperature at Endeavor's emission point exceeded 2,000 degrees Celsius. The air around him warped with heat distortion. A column of fire wide enough to engulf a city bus lanced upward through 40 meters of altitude toward the figure that had not moved. It vanished at approximately 12 meters from the target. Not extinguished, not deflected, not absorbed in any thermodynamic sense that would have produced a corresponding energy output somewhere else. The fire was present, and then the fire was not present. The atoms that had been combusting ceased to exist in any detectable state. The light that had been traveling from the flame simply stopped. Endeavor Flame Hero Incident Debrief. In 23 years I have never thrown fire that didn't land somewhere. Even if it was blocked, even if it was dispersed, there was always a result. Energy goes somewhere, that's physics. This had no result. My fire went into a zone of, I don't have the word, absence. Not even heat remained. I stood there with my hands out and there was nothing in front of them. Hawks from above watched the hellflame disappear and processed what he was seeing with a speed that most humans couldn't match. His brain, trained for threat assessment at velocities that made conventional thinking non-viable, registered the following in approximately 0.3 seconds. Conventional energy output is not a viable attack vector. The entity has demonstrated matter-state control without visible mechanism. Acceleration of physical mass, i.e. himself, at the target carries unknown but potentially severe risk. Reconnaissance priority should override engagement priority. Hawk sent the alert and Held position. It was the right call. It was not a cowardly call. It was the only call available to a mind that was operating correctly with the information it had. He would have a hard time explaining this to himself afterward, in the dark quiet of his own head, because heroism in his culture is not a thing you calculate, but he calculated it, and he was right. 0822. Best Genist is, by any technical measure, one of the most sophisticated combat tacticians in hero society. His Fiber Master quirk isn't brute force, it's control, surgical and patient and impossibly precise. He has restrained opponents faster than the eye can track. He has bound targets from 100 meters with threads that can exert pressures equivalent to steel cable. The fibers reached the entity and fell. Not cut, not burned, not repelled by any physical force. They simply lost coherence at contact with whatever field existed in the space immediately surrounding the figure. Genist described it as his threads forgetting their shape, an unsettling metaphor that the HPSC's materials analysis team later determined was actually physically accurate. The molecular bonding that gave the fibers their tensile strength had been disrupted at a level below what any known quirk could access. Edshot's penetration attempt was faster than sound and arrived at nothing. He passed through the space where the entity stood and found himself on the other side of a moment he had no frame for, body intact, mission unaccomplished, with the distinct and career-altering sensation of having passed through a wall made of indifference. Edshot Ninja Hero Incident Debrief. I have fought people who have absolute hardening, people who can phase through solid matter, people with barriers I've broken by coming in faster than the barrier could form. I know how resistance feels. I know how to read it and go around it or through it. There was no resistance. There was nothing to read. I went through the geometry of where he was standing and arrived somewhere that didn't feel like the other side of anything. At 082341, with 4 of the response unit's primary strategies neutralized without the entity having moved or spoken again, the emergency committee in the HPSC's command center did something that had not been done in 8 years. They called All Might. 0824. There's a particular quality to All Might's entrances that no other hero has replicated and that no amount of training can manufacture. It's not the wind displacement from his movement speed, though that's considerable. It's not the visual impact of his silhouette, though that's designed and practiced and effective. It's the thing that happens to the emotional register of the air in the space around him, a shift in the ambient atmosphere of a crisis, a redistribution of the psychological weight, as though his presence itself metabolizes fear and converts it to something that can be used. Heroes on the ground who watched him arrive reported an involuntary loosening of the tension they'd been carrying. Civilians who saw his approach on news feeds described feeling, for the first time since the event began, like there was a reason to breathe. He was retired. He was running on the last ember of a flame that had been burning for 30 years. He came anyway. All Might deployed at full output, which is to say at the full output of what remained to him, which was still more than virtually anything else on Earth could produce. He crossed the distance from his approach vector to engagement range in under a second. His fist connected at Detroit smash velocity, the kind of impact that had shattered concrete and collapsed villain operations and literally altered weather patterns. The shockwave fractured infrastructure within 800 meters, windows, pavement, the load-bearing columns of 2 parking structures, the facade of a building that had been standing for 40 years. The force was real. The impact was confirmed by 14 different instruments. The entity moved 3 inches. Not from the force, not to compensate or absorb. It shifted 3 inches in the way you shift when something small and inconsequential touches you, not reactively, but incidentally. The way you adjust your position when a draft moves through a room. And it said one word. Finite. That word landed harder than All Might's punch. Because All Might's punch, even the most devastating punch in the history of hero society, had a ceiling. Everyone in that space suddenly understood, with a clarity that bypassed denial, what that ceiling was and what existed above it. All Might incident debrief. I have faced things that made me bleed, things that made me afraid, things that came closer than the public ever knew to ending me. In all of it, I always knew my next step. I always had something left to try. Standing there after that word, I had nothing, not because I was injured, because I understood for the first time what it means to be a finite thing in the presence of something that isn't. The cameras caught his face in the moment after. It aired on every news channel in Japan within 90 seconds. Hero society had never seen that expression on that face. It had no precedent and therefore no framework for processing it. That expression, broadcast to millions in real time, was its own kind of detonation. 082600 communication grid enters cascade failure. HPSC emergency classification, tier existential, first use of this designation in hero society history. The systems were designed to handle emergencies, large ones, multi-villain coordinated attacks, natural disasters, infrastructure collapse. They were not designed to handle a thing that rendered their own operations irrelevant as a byproduct of existing near them. The communication blackout began without announcement and without visible cause. 60% of the surveillance satellite array that covered the Musutafu metropolitan area went dark, not damaged, not jammed in any detectable electromagnetic sense, but dark. The processing nodes at the HPSC command center began receiving signal corruption that their engineers would spend 3 weeks afterward trying to trace to a source, and never successfully would. The Quirk analysis AI, which had been running continuously since the initial manifestation, produced its first and only classification at 082617, unable to categorize, reference framework insufficient. That output, that specific, honest, carefully worded admission of insufficiency from a system that had successfully classified over 40,000 unique Quirk interactions, was filed in the incident report and quietly became one of the most discussed documents in the HPSC's internal review. The system didn't crash, it didn't malfunction. It looked at the data available to it and told the truth. It had no reference framework. It had never been given one for this. Tier existential. The designation had existed in Hero Society's emergency management documentation for 11 years. It had been written into the framework during a post-war review process by a small committee of analysts who were thinking, at the time, about scenarios involving weapons of mass destruction or coordinated global-scale villain mobilization, things that threaten not just people, but the continuity of the social structure itself. It had never been used. Most of the people in the HPSC command center on the morning of the incident had never heard it spoken aloud in a professional context. The committee director who authorized its deployment at 082703 would later say she spent approximately 4 seconds deciding whether to use it before concluding that the criteria had been met and that her hesitation was personal reluctance, not professional uncertainty. The difference between this designation and every previous emergency classification in Hero Society's history is structural, not merely scalar. A priority alpha says, something very bad is happening and we need our best people at full capacity immediately. Tier existential says, the thing that is happening is not a problem our system can solve by executing its current programming more efficiently. It is a problem that our system may not be adequate to. That distinction between a crisis the system can handle and a crisis the system may be unable to handle is the distinction that Hero Society had never had occasion to make before. And making it, officially and on record, set off a cascade of institutional reactions that the creators of the tier existential designation had thought about but not fully anticipated. Here is the thing about villains, even the most extreme and ideologically committed ones. They have a relationship with Hero Society. It might be oppositional, it might be violent, it might be expressed in terms of wanting to burn the whole structure to the ground, but it's a relationship. Villains like Shigaraki, like All for One, like even the League of Villains at their most nihilistic, were operating within a frame that assumed Hero Society's existence was meaningful enough to be worth destroying. That assumption is itself a form of engagement. You cannot wage war on something you consider beneath notice. Darkseid had said 7 words and then stood in the sky while heroes exhausted their arsenals against him, and none of those words or any of the subsequent silence expressed any relationship with Hero Society at all. Not contempt. Contempt requires the contemptible thing to matter enough to feel contempt toward, not rage, not ideology, not even the cold pragmatic hostility of an entity with opposing goals. The HPSC committee assigned to behavioral analysis during the incident would produce a 60-page report that struggled productively and honestly with this question: what does an entity want when it doesn't communicate want? When its opening statement is a diagnosis rather than a demand? When its response to the greats? Physical force Hero Society can produce is a single adjective. The closest the report came to an answer was this: the entity was not seeking submission in the way a dominator seeks submission, not the bending of will through overwhelming force until the weaker party capitulates. It was making an observation. It was noting with apparent dispassion the gap between what Hero Society believed itself to be and what it actually was. The submission being sought, if that word even applied, was not political or physical. It was epistemic. It wanted, if that word applied, them to know. 083100 National Broadcast Feed showing real-time engagement. Civilian psychological impact metrics begin exponential decline. Social media crisis index enters red zone. Everything that happened in the sky above Musutafu was visible. That was not an accident of geography or circumstance. Hero Society, in its commitment to transparency and public assurance, had built a media apparatus that was extraordinarily good at broadcasting its victories. The same apparatus, operating exactly as designed, broadcast this. 18 million people watched in real time as Endeavor's fire became nothing. 22 million watched All Might arrive. 26 million watched him land his punch and achieve nothing of consequence. 31 million heard the word finite through their screens and felt it settle into them like a stone dropping through water. The Psychological Stability Index, a composite metric drawn from real-time social media sentiment analysis, emergency psychological support call volume, physiological stress indicators from wearable devices and economic activity patterns, began its decline at 08/24/19 precisely when All Might's punch made contact and did not result in victory. It dropped 3% in the first minute, 7% in the second. By 08:35 it was 41% below baseline. By 09:01 when the incident concluded, it had fallen 63%. These are numbers, behind them are people. The HPSC's post-incident psychological research team conducted interviews with over 4,000 individuals across the country in the weeks following the event. The responses clustered around several distinct emotional experiences, and what's striking about them is not their variety but their consistency across demographic lines, age, region, professional background, personal relationship to hero culture. Interview subject 14, male, age 43, office worker, Osaka. I wasn't even in Musutafu. I was watching from my desk on my phone, but when I saw All Might's face after, I turned off the screen and sat there for maybe 10 minutes. I couldn't tell you what I was thinking. I don't think I was thinking. Something just went offline. Interview subject 89, female, age 28, nurse, Tokyo. The thing that scared me wasn't the entity. It was All Might's eyes. I've seen that face 1,000 times. On merchandise, on old broadcasts, on everything. I know that face, and I didn't recognize what I was seeing in it. That was when I understood this was different. Interview subject 237, male, age 71, retired school principal Musutafu. I grew up believing, not just hoping, believing that there would always be someone who could handle the worst thing. Someone who was enough. Watching the broadcast, I understood for the first time that I had built my piece on an assumption I'd never examined, and the assumption was wrong. The experience described by subject 237, the sudden awareness of an unexamined assumption, was the most common psychological theme in the research team's analysis. It wasn't simple fear. Fear can be processed. Fear has an object and a response protocol. What people described was closer to what philosophers call ontological shock, a disruption not of safety but of reality's architecture, the sudden understanding that the world is differently shaped than you believed. Hero Society had, as a function of its own success, created a population that had outsourced existential security to a professional class. This is not a criticism, it's what functional societies do. You outsource dentistry to dentists and surgery to surgeons, and the management of catastrophic threats to people specifically trained and equipped for that management. The system worked. Until the system encountered a threat it could not manage, in full public view on every screen, in real time. The children. UA High School went into lockdown at 08/21. The students were aware something significant was occurring. Many of them accessed news feeds on personal devices before faculty could implement the school's media restriction protocol. Midoriya Izuku watched 60 seconds of the broadcast before his phone was confiscated. He had seen enough to understand what he was looking at. He sat in the lockdown room for the remainder of the incident with his notebook open to a blank page, which he did not write on. Bakugo Katsuki watched the same 60 seconds and then handed his phone over without being asked. He stood at the window. They'd been directed away from windows, but he stood there anyway and looked out at the sky in the direction of the commercial district, jaw set, not speaking. Todoroki Shoto processed the information with the particular stillness that those who knew him recognized as not calm, but the exterior surface of something much less calm happening underneath. These are specific children, named because they are particular people with particular histories and particular relationships to the symbol that had just been shown to be finite. But they stood in for a generation of young people who had chosen, deliberately and at great personal cost, to dedicate their lives to becoming the next layer of Hero Society's structure. Who had made that choice partly because they believed the structure was worth maintaining, and partly because they believed it was possible to maintain. The 60 seconds they'd watched had not destroyed that belief, but it had changed its quality. It had made it something you had to choose rather than something you could assume, and choosing is harder. All Might re-engages, verbal exchange commences, duration 11 minutes 23 seconds, full transcript classified at HPSC director level, partial transcript available in Appendix C. The physical engagement had failed. Every tactical option available to Hero Society had been deployed and rendered moot. And so, with approximately 14 minutes remaining in the incident's active phase, All Might did the only thing left to him. He talked. This is not a diminishment. Talking, in the context of a being that had unmade fire and shrugged off the force of a legend, was an act of extraordinary courage. Not because it was likely to work, but because All Might had spent his entire career understanding that his most important function was not the force of his punch. It was the quality of his presence, what he embodied, what people felt when they saw him choose to stand rather than fall. He fell upward to engagement distance, 40 meters above the street, approximately level with the figure's chest, and he opened his mouth and he began. A full transcript of what was said in those 11 minutes and 23 seconds has been classified at HPSC director level. What follows is reconstructed from the partial transcript available to this report, from All Might's own debrief statement, and from the audio captured by 3 separate media helicopters, cross-referenced and verified. All Might began with the argument he knew best, the one his life had been built to demonstrate. He talked about the people below, the 3.2 million who had been displaced, the families in the evacuation corridors, the children in the lockdown schools. He talked about them not as leverage, not as hostages to the entity's mercy, but as evidence. Evidence that the thing worth protecting existed, was real, had faces and names and plans for the afternoon. He was doing what he had always done, making the abstract concrete, making the distant immediate. All Might incident debrief. I told him about a girl I'd met after a rescue 3 years prior. She was 7. She'd been trapped in a collapsed building for 4 hours. When I pulled her out, the first thing she said was that she knew I was coming. She just knew. I told him about her. I told him her name. I don't know why. I thought if I could make one person real to him. The entity listened. This detail that it listened is significant. It did not interrupt. It did not dismiss. In the partial transcript, there's an 11-second silence after All Might's description of the girl that the behavioral analysis team spent considerable time on. An 11-second silence from a being that had shown no interest in anything Hero Society had to offer is not nothing. What broke the silence was this. You speak of those who believe in you. I speak of the belief itself. You have taught them that virtue follows power. When power fails, what becomes of their virtue? This is the question at the center of everything. Hero Society had, in building its structure, created a cultural association between power and goodness that was so deep and so pervasive that most people who lived inside it had never examined it. Heroes were the good people. The good people were the powerful people. The ranking system ranked them. The public trusted the rankings. Virtue and capacity had been soldered together. What the entity was pointing to, and All Might understood it in real time, because All Might was smarter about human beings than he was usually given credit for, was a foundational design flaw. When the most powerful person in the world could be made to look helpless, what happened to the moral certainty that had been attached to his power? All Might had an answer. Of course he had an answer. He had been living the answer for 30 years. Virtue is not a product of power. It is a choice made by people in the face of powerlessness. The girl wasn't brave because I was strong. She was brave because she chose to believe. That choice belongs to her. Another silence, shorter this time, 6 seconds. Then, and when the object of that belief is revealed as finite, as all things are, will the choice survive the revelation? All Might didn't answer immediately, not because he didn't have words, because the question deserved the honesty of a pause. When he did answer, it was not the answer of a hero delivering a speech. It was the answer of a man who had thought about this in hospital beds, in the years since his retirement, in the quiet terror of watching his successor carry a weight he understood too well. I don't know, that's the honest answer. I don't know if the choice survives. I know it has to be given the chance. I know that some of them will find their own strength. And I know that my job right now, in this moment, is to not give up in front of them. Not because I can win, but because giving up is the worst lesson I could teach. What happened next is the detail that every analysis of this incident returns to and cannot fully resolve. The entity was silent for 22 seconds, and then it moved not toward All Might, not toward the city, not in any direction that read as aggressive. It simply elevated. 40 meters became 80, became 160, the figure ascending back toward the fold in space that it had emerged from, the geometry of the sky reconstituting itself around it as it went. At 0901:14 JST, the distortion closed. No statement, no declaration of outcome, no acknowledgement of All Might's words or any indication of whether they had mattered. It left. The incident officially was over. Hero Society had survived. The physical damage to Musutafu was significant but not catastrophic. Infrastructure repair was estimated at 18 months of ongoing work. No civilian casualties had occurred during the incident, partly through the efficiency of the evacuation protocols and partly through the entity's apparent disinterest in causing civilian harm directly. By conventional metrics, this was survivable. By conventional metrics, you could call it with appropriate caveats something like a victory. The entity came, the heroes responded, the civilians got out, the entity left. Conventional metrics are the wrong tool for this particular job. The 63% drop in Hero Society's psychological stability index did not fully recover. 6 months after the incident, it sat at 81% of its pre-incident baseline, a figure that sounds like recovery, but represents, in absolute terms, a permanent reduction in the cultural faith that had been Hero Society's most fundamental resource. The media transparency protocols underwent their first major revision in 15 years in the 3 months following the event. The revision was not, officially, a response to the incident. Internally, everyone understood that it was. The question of what to broadcast and what to manage had become, suddenly, far more complicated. A media apparatus designed to show people heroes winning had to reckon with the possibility that what people needed to see was not always victory, and that what it meant to be a hero was not coextensive with the capacity to prevail. The Hero Billboard chart's next quarterly release was the most discussed in its history, not for its rankings but for an editorial note that accompanied it, authored by the HPSC director, that acknowledged for the first time publicly that the ranking system measured one kind of heroic capability, and that the incident had demonstrated the existence of challenges that the ranking system's metrics were not designed to evaluate. This was a small acknowledgement, carefully worded, buried in a document that most people read primarily for the numbers. It was also, for those paying attention, a significant institutional admission that the structure needed re-examination. Endeavor returned to active duty 11 days after the incident. He performed at professional standard. He did not speak publicly about the experience for 8 months, and when he did, it was in a single sentence at the end of a press conference about an unrelated case. There are things you learn about yourself when you do everything right, and it means nothing. I'm still working out what to do with that. Hawks recalibrated his operational philosophy in the aftermath, shifting more of his strategic weight toward intelligence gathering and systemic vulnerability analysis. He had been doing this informally for years. After the incident, he did it with intention. If force had a ceiling, then the work below the ceiling, the information, the preparation, the anticipation, became more important, not less. All Might aged visibly in the weeks following the incident. Not dramatically, not in a way that alarmed the medical professionals overseeing his post-hero health management, but those who knew him well and saw him in those weeks described a man who had encountered a question he was still in the process of living with. He continued teaching. He continued showing up. He remained, as he had always been, the man who chose to be present. Midoriya Izuku opened his notebook 2 days after the incident and began writing. He wrote for 6 hours without stopping, covering 43 pages with analysis, questions, observed patterns, strategic hypotheses, and in the margins of several pages, things that weren't analysis, observations about what it means to keep moving when the destination looks different than you thought it would. He would never show these specific pages to anyone. What emerged from those 6 hours and from the conversations that rippled through the UA student body in the following weeks was something that the faculty would later identify with careful optimism as a maturation event. The students who emerged from the incident still wanted to be heroes. They wanted it with a quality different from the wanting that had preceded it. It was less automatic, more examined. The belief had been tested, and they had, each in their own way and at their own pace, chosen to hold it. The choice, as All Might had said, belonged to them. Here is what Darkseid left behind when he stepped back through the fold in space and left Musutafu's sky to reconstitute itself. He left behind a question that Hero Society had never formally asked itself. What is the relationship between power and virtue? Are they the same thing? Do they produce each other? Or are they separate, virtue a thing that exists independent of the capacity to win? He left behind an awareness of finitude that the culture had spent 30 years papering over with rankings and broadcasts, and the carefully maintained image of a man who always arrived in time. Finite is not a condemnation. It is a fact. The question is what you do with it. He left behind a generation of young heroes who had seen their ceiling and had to decide, with that knowledge, whether to keep climbing. Most of them did. That is the part of this story that doesn't get written into case files. And he left behind, for those willing to look at it clearly, an invitation, not a welcome one, not delivered with any warmth, but an invitation to be something that didn't require an external source of strength to maintain its integrity. To be good not because it was guaranteed to work, but because it was worth being. Hero Society failed the stress test. That is the finding of this reconstruction, and it is stated plainly because plainness is what the finding requires. It failed because its infrastructure was optimized for a category of challenge that this incident was not a member of. It failed because its psychological architecture was built on a certainty that turned out to be an assumption. It failed because it had not, before that Tuesday morning, asked itself what it would do if the thing it encountered was not a villain but a mirror. These failures are not permanent, they are not damning. They are, in the language of structural analysis, opportunities for redesign. The more interesting question, the one that this reconstruction ultimately arrives at, is not whether Hero Society failed. It is whether it will use the failure, whether the 63% drop in stability will resolve into the 81% that pretends the gap doesn't exist, or whether it will become the foundation of something more honest, something that knows what it is and chooses to be it anyway. In the 11 minutes and 23 seconds of that conversation, 40 meters above Musutafu, a man who had no power left made an argument for choosing virtue in the face of powerlessness. An entity that had existed for longer than the culture it was addressing went silent for 22 seconds and then left without violence. This report will not speculate on what those 22 seconds meant. The data is insufficient. What is sufficient, what is, at the end of 47 minutes and all the days that followed, the only fact that this reconstruction is certain of, is that All Might stood in the sky when he had no reason left to stand, except that standing was the right thing to do, and that 10,000 people on the ground saw him do it, and that some of them carried that image into the next day and chose their next step accordingly. Finite, yes. Still standing.